Hello and welcome to India's World. The 8th BRICS summit has just come to an end in Goa with a long and wordy declaration. What have been the achievements of BRICS up to now, and what were the specific outcomes of the Goa summit held under India's chairmanship? BRICS, an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, is meant to highlight the combined potential of non-Western powers controlling a quarter of the world's landmass and accounting for more than 40% of its population. It is meant to be primarily a financial collective to promote trade relations among the member countries, and therefore it gives precedence to economic matters over domestic and foreign affairs of the member nations. To promote growth, the 5 member countries have also set up their own development bank in parallel to the US-dominated International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The newly formed multilateral New Development Bank has been widely praised in the BRICS summit in Goa for its achievements over the last 1 year and its support for clean energy and sustainable development projects. To discuss the relevance of BRICS, its potential and its achievements up to now, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Ajai Malhotra, a distinguished diplomat. He's been India's ambassador to Kuwait, Romania and most significantly for this discussion, to Russia. Professor Alka Acharya, she's the Director of Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi as well as Professor of Chinese Studies at the School of International Studies, JNU, New Delhi. And we're lucky to have with us Professor Manoj Pant, an eminent economist. He's Professor at the Center for International Trade and Development at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's an expert on international trade. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ambassador Malhotra, let me begin with you because you've been associated with BRICS since its inception. Have the BRICS countries succeeded in justifying the prediction that separately and together they will dominate the 21st century? China and Russia individually to some extent do play that kind of a role. But what about Brazil, India and South Africa?
Well, let me start by saying that the country that will dominate for the next 20-30 years is certainly USA. Let's not get that wrong. But if you look at this combination of 5 important emerging economies, I think they have a weight and a contribution to make. And the intention is to make the world more multipolar, as they say, so that other views and other positions can also get credence rather than them being dominated by one power with a global reach, I would put it, rather than a superpower, because that itself is a little questionable. You have said, have they lived up to their expectations? I recall the first meeting that took place at the ministerial level, and I was part organizer and certainly present at that, was in 2006 on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. At that stage, even then, BRIC was still an attractive sounding acronym and nobody had really moved on it, except that the Russians had tried to push that forward. Now, where are these countries headed? South Africa and Brazil, at the moment, their economies are not doing particularly well and they have little complexities in their situation, even politically. India has a stable government under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, and the economy is doing comparatively well. China is also not doing too badly. It might be the rate of growth is declining, but it is still at a very high positive rate of growth. Russia is bottoming out. This year, the growth would be minus 0.8%, but next year it is expected to be plus 1.1%. So that downturn in the Russian economy is over, and therefore you can certainly look at these economies doing better as we go ahead.
Okay. Professor Acharya, what have been the achievements of BRICS in trying to create an alternative to US hegemony in the sphere of the economy and in the sphere of international politics?
I think there has certainly been a degree of success in coming across as a grouping which is now increasingly assertive about its rights within the current global economic and financial architecture. The Chinese rise of the Chinese economy, and the Chinese have been pretty loud about claiming that their voting rights, for instance, within the IMF, World Bank, their role there should be recognized in terms of the economy, the size of the economy that it is today. And it has taken them a pretty long time to persuade the West to loosen up, as it were. But the coming together of BRICS has certainly helped in adding more ballast, because here, despite, and I agree completely that the economic performance is uneven, there is certainly Brazil and South Africa going through tough times, but still as a collective, it's about a quarter or more of the world's GDP. And I think that is now increasingly being recognized. And I think the coming of the BRICS itself brought about a shift, because we saw a change in the way in which they were giving out those credits to all the countries. So to that limited extent, BRICS has worked. Geopolitically, I think there has always been a mixed kind of a sense, because clearly none of the 5 BRICS countries wants to see this as a grouping which is destined to work against the West. They all have got very substantial stakes with the West, and they, at this point, they are certainly not in a mood to take on the West in a geopolitical sense. So they have been very careful to say that this is not directed against anything. It's in the interests of the recognition of a new phenomenon in the global economy. I think that's...
Professor Pant, how have the adverse global economic conditions, falling global demand, lower oil and commodity prices, how have they taken their toll on the potential of BRICS?
Let me, if you don't mind, let me take a slightly back to relate to what they were saying. Think of when this BRICS acronym first came up. 2001, some Tim O'Neill or Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs coined this. Now, what was the context in which he cited this? He cited in the context of the fact that after 95 and actually till 2007, the fastest growth of trade was between emerging countries, right? And actually also true for these countries. Now, I guess we'll come back to this later on, but I'm going to say that has not been fulfilled. In fact, we are going backwards. And it is not working as an economic grouping. And I'll come back later if you want on more details.
No, tell us now.
Okay, well, very simple. One way of figuring out how an economic grouping is working, so that was the objective, is what is the share of trade which these countries have among themselves as the share of their trade in the rest of the world. Normally, one would expect if a grouping is working as economic, it should be increasing. And I'll give you very simple numbers. It was roughly about 6.4% in 1995, went up to 14% in 2007, slipping back now to 10%. Even that, if you look, even the numbers till 2007, entirely driven by exports of raw materials, coal, steel, etc., from all these countries to China. Why? Because the Chinese Olympics. Ever since then, the Olympics have disappeared, and China itself is in doldrums. So the basis on which the first classification of BRICS is a very strong economic group don't exist at all anymore. Okay. So that's my first problem.
Okay, but Mr. Malhotra, you yourself said that Russia is going to recover, but Russia has slipped into recession.
Brazil has passed more or less. I think it is.
Brazil is still in recession. China's, the engine of growth of the world is also contracting. It's not growing at the rate it was expected to. South Africa has just managed to avoid the fate of other BRICS countries. The only exception is India. 7.6% projected growth in the coming financial year. Now, is this sufficient to lift BRICS as a grouping, or is the group in doldrums, as Manoj says?
Well, you see, the BRICS focus has also been on 2 other aspects, one of which Alka had touched upon, which is finance, to put pressure on the IMF to give them greater weight in the voting pattern of the IMF. And when the 15th round now takes place, that's what they'll be pressing for. Okay. And they have had some degree of success in pushing this forward to say, as emerging economies, our countries need a greater voice, but you cannot take it away from the least developed countries and give it to us. Okay. So that is the financial aspect. On the trade aspect, I think it has been correctly pointed out, the major country in trade is China. If you look at countries worldwide, 2/3 of them, their #1 trading partner is China. So that has its own implications. And yes, there is a pattern out there that is very clear. There is also one more thing that BRICS does, and that is look at global international issues and position itself. And you would see even in the declaration that has come out, it runs into over 109 plus, 109 odd paras. There are references to Syria, Afghanistan, the situation there. And again, there have been off and on initiatives to try and get involved up there, or one or another country takes the opportunity of the support and ballast that comes from being a member of BRICS to try and prop up its own position on global international issues. So there are these 3 aspects to it. Let's not forget that BRICS started off, in fact, originally it started off as India, Russia, China.
Yes.
If you go back to 1993, when it was first sounded off informally, 1998 when Primakov came here and referred to it, 2001 when Jim O'Neill mentioned. But in all of this, the idea was to have a meeting point where you could discuss economic and financial issues broadly. And so given that, it's made some progress. As you said, the NDB, the CRA, these are important developments. You're looking at a credit rating agency.
We're going to discuss that in a bit.
So there are things ahead that lie ahead, which have positive implications.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the potential of BRICS and the outcomes of the BRICS summit at Goa. Manoj, what have been the achievements of the new development bank set up by BRICS? Is it likely to make much of a difference on how the world economy functions in the long run? And how significant are the loans of more than $900 million it has given for renewable energy projects and to BRICS countries?
See, if you, as Ambassador also commented, one of the purposes of the BRICS Bank was to be a countervailing force to the World Bank. That look, you guys tend not to give us money, ask us for too many questions, so we'll do it among ourselves. Now that's only going to work if a lot of trade takes place between these countries. Otherwise, who are you going to give the money to what? Now this 900 million is chicken feed, frankly, in terms of international affairs. Now I'll tell you what the problem is. As far as I know, and this is more, I guess, Alka's area than mine, but as far as I know, the whole purpose of China in this was, China had its own problems with the developed world is coming up. So they were thinking of this as a very important economic block, which it hasn't worked. And I can give you more numbers for that. But if you look, therefore, what's happening? I personally am quite confident that the purpose of the development bank, of which majority of the money comes from China, will be to finance China's infrastructure expansion in most of South Asian countries. Because for them, it's important to keep the demand going. China cannot survive on becoming a buyer. They have to survive politically on being a seller in the world market. And they're not able to sell goods, as we know. So they're trying to sell their services. The economy itself is moving towards services.
If it works only in the interest of China, then it's not going to work for the other BRICS countries.
Because the other part is not happening. And just to give you one more small number, it's an important number. Why is this trade not happening with these countries? This mirage of 2095, 2007 because of the Olympics. You look at the reason why. One thing which drives trade in any country is foreign investment. Typically, foreign investment precedes or comes after. You look at the state of affairs of these countries. China's foreign investment goes entirely to some African countries and some non-South African countries. Brazil's FDI goes almost entirely to Latin America and some other countries. India's FDI goes mainly to USA and UK. You know, these are not driving trades, and the motivations of these countries for why they were there is very different. I'll come back to that later if you want.
Alka, there are people who say that the common factor for all BRICS countries is that they struggle economically because of institutional weaknesses. Okay, there is lack of democratic accountability, transparency in public life. There's no independent media scrutiny of governance. So can you foster sustained economic cooperation and trade in the absence of strong democratic institutions? And I have China in mind.
No, I think if you are looking at purely business and commerce, I think the Chinese have evolved models which beat everybody hollow. And just to take the point which Manoj was saying, that China is trying to build itself as a seller. But now it is projecting itself, and I slightly move away, that it's now trying to project itself as the biggest consumer market. 10% growth year on year that they are saying that here is a market, please come and sell to us. Now, clearly they are going to position themselves as the dynamo within this group. I think two things need to be remembered. One, when we start assessing BRICS, number one, we cannot use the same yardsticks that we are doing with regard to other institutions that came about in the West. Looking at it purely as an economic grouping which came together for an economic rationale would also not be right. Jim O'Neill came up with BRICS, but the whole point was that they came up as investment destinations in the fastest growing economies. And I don't think that has been the motivation for BRICS. And neither, thirdly, is the purely geopolitical assessment of BRICS going to work? I think if we are going to look at this as a heavyweight, counterweight kind of thing, it won't work. Question now is, yes, this point that all the countries are pretty disparate, whether you look at population, size, GDP, growth rates, institutional development, and yet we are talking about how do you expand the area of interest. And that is where I think we are moving away from purely financial to a larger area of interest to the developing nature of all these economies, which is about employment, which is about equalizing the benefits of this growth and development, because you see these are all very highly unequal societies.
Yep. Mr. Malhotra, do you think India's strategic competition with China and the dip in India's relationship with Russia that we have witnessed of late, have they impacted the efficacy of BRICS?
Well, I would have to contest that point about a dip in India's relations with Russia. I don't think that has taken place, and I think President Putin's visit just now and the bilaterals you had really show that that continuity exists, and in fact has probably strengthened in some very important
But hasn't our relationship with them, which used to be the primary relationship, become secondary because India is part of US pivot to Asia? And that is, people say that is why you're saying Russia reaching out to Pakistan.
I would absolutely reject that. Okay. And if you give me the time, I would be able to explain why. But you see, Russia and India, it's based on continuity and common interests. And you will not find a change in this taking place.
And the strategic competition with China?
The strategic competition between India and China?
Yes.
Yes. I think China is much bigger at the moment. And we need at the moment to build up our muscle and our strength if we intend being in a strategic competition with them. We are not at that position. Even as you have hinted, even now we are importing most of our defense requirements from Russia, from USA, from Israel, etc. That is hardly the position of a country that wants to be in strategic competition with anyone, that when you're already yourself dependent on imports. And I think up there the policy being followed is the right one. Make in India to the extent you can, because that is the first thing you need to do. So strategic competition, we are not in that. Not now in any case. Maybe at some later stage, and I think at a later stage we will come and have to face
But as of
that.
now, you're saying neither of these is a factor.
No, strategic competition with China, I don't think we are...
You're saying strategic competition doesn't exist and our relationship with Russia is
strategic competition
with what
would
it was
exist
in the past.
Looking way ahead, I would say 15 to 20 years ahead, as long as we take the correctives in our domestic manufacture for defense equipment, etc., and become non-reliant on anyone for being able to take the steps that require the autonomy of action. That is hugely important for being in competition with a big, probably the second power at the moment, which is China.
All right. Okay. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the outcomes of the BRICS summit in Goa. Alka, what was the significance of the BIMSTEC outreach at Goa? Does it mean that India expects that Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar and Thailand would be willing to forego their cooperation with China, which is not part of BIMSTEC, for the sake of bonhomie with India? And does it also mean that BIMSTEC will become the alternative to SAARC because we've managed to keep Pakistan out?
I think to the first I would say that not likely, because we are now looking at a very, very strong involvement of China in the economies of our neighbors. And clearly it is something that India cannot at this point give to them. So for them, China is going to be a very significant player. Now, bringing in BIMSTEC in this, at this point, I don't think that there is a conscious strategy at this point to see an alternative to SAARC, although it's a smart move in the current direction, because in the current scenario, because apart from Maldives, I think, and Pakistan, all the others are part of it, and Afghanistan is also not there. So you have all of them, and already this displeasure with Pakistan's role in the whole question of terrorism has been conveyed, and therefore the SAARC got cancelled. But I think what we need to understand is that more than the strategic competition with China or this alternative to regional organizations, we have to actually start to carve our strategy working with both. You can't wish China away from the subcontinent. And if you try to say that your neighbors have to choose between you and China, then I'm afraid we're going to be having a tricky
Manoj,
problem.
You are an economist and a trade economist at that. Trade and economic cooperation works only when you have a grouping that is expansive, which tells more people to come in.
Right.
A grouping that says, keep this person out and keep that country out is unlikely to succeed, because that's not in the nature of globalization today.
See, more generally, if you want to analyze a grouping like BRICS, you can get into geopolitics, there's no end to the discussion. It can be either an economic grouping or a political grouping.
No, I was thinking in terms of BIMSTEC and, trying to keep people out.
No, the point is BIMSTEC itself has a problem. Because one of the important components, there are two components, Malaysia, Thailand, for example, is now part of ASEAN. And ASEAN has own dynamics because they want to become part of the EU. That's the declaration of 2015. So it's a different dynamics. BIMSTEC's dynamics itself are not going to be affected only by India. I do believe SAARC was a very important political instrument, but I won't go into that. That's a different issue. I'm saying think of BRICS as what? What is it meant to be? And that's where I find the confusion in India. Is it an economic grouping? Which I'm saying it's not, and it will not be. I can cite numbers.
I think that's been
is it a political thing?
Discussed
is it a political instrument? How? Because normally what people do is whatever grouping they have, they use them in other international fora, whether it's the WTO or whether now the climate negotiations. Who do we have a commonality with any one of them? Tell me quickly.
This point about exclusion and inclusion, I think, is very significant, because at this point what we are looking at is, in fact, if the competition, you ask me, is about the kind of visions both India and China are laying out for Asia. We talk about China and India in Asia and the importance of their relationship. What are the kind of visions about economic development, regional integration, connectivities are both countries putting out? And I think that's going to be a...
Well, I just want to make a point that the decision to invite BIMSTEC was taken well before all this issue on, Pathankot, Uri, etc., relating to Pakistan came about. And it is part of a broader policy approach. Act east rather than look east, be a little more. And the only point, I think, which is worth looking at here is there's an issue of connectivity in this larger area. There's an issue of trade improvement, etc. Yeah. And this can be worked on. You can use the bank, the new development bank you have, to fund infrastructure projects up here. Maybe to move away from the China proposal. China, Bangladesh.
Why move away from one belt, one road and the
No. I'm not talking of one belt, one road, because one belt, one road doesn't is not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is when you have such meetings, you need to have proper follow-up, which makes it worthwhile.
I want to make a important interjection. Where I'm going to disagree with you, that's why I want to interject.
Well, let me finish and then you can interject.
No, just on that first part, on that point you made about the use of the bank in our link to the east. Yeah. One of the major roads, if you look at the plans which are there on table, are through Arunachal. And China is never going to agree with that. ADB doesn't lend us. Do you think China will ever agree to that? And I know what's going to happen. India is going to say, therefore, we will not agree on BIMSTEC. So this bank is going to go
but that's not the only road. That connectivity could be through Manipur too.
I'm talking of something quite different.
Okay.
No, I'm talking of something quite different. Yeah. I'm saying that if we have to look to connectivities into Southeast Asia and beyond, and not looking at the overlap that exists between these countries, you know that where's the money? The funds are really with China. And it would be using its own Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, in any case, to do this kind of thing. It has a proposal in this area. So it is important that we use this movement for some follow-up thereafter. Otherwise, you're just having a meeting on the sidelines and nothing much is happening, like happened when the Russians did it with the Eurasians and the Brazilians did it when they hosted their summit with the Latins.
We're really running out of time. Alka, while terrorism doesn't impact all the BRICS countries as it impacts India, so why was so much emphasis on condemning terrorism? Does it change anything? Is China going to change its attitude towards Pakistan, towards Jaish-e-Mohammed, towards blocking Masood Azhar's name being included in the UN terror list?
No, I think it's not true to say that India is the only country not affected, because China is clearly having now serious concerns. There are inroads
in Xinjiang, yes, but I'm saying that they're managing it. They're not attacking Pakistan for that. They've not criticized Pakistan for that. Although their Uyghur terrorists also come from Pakistan and Afghanistan.
It will not be realistic to expect China to change its stand anytime soon. However, I do believe that consistent pushing at this issue, because look at it this way, you cannot do anything without China. It's better to start looking at how you can intelligently use China in this game, because If there's any one country,
point was, why waste so much political energy on terrorism when at the cost of your other goals? That is economic cooperation, greater trade, greater lobbying power in climate negotiations with IMF and others.
I would say, because let's face it, terrorism is an important domestic political goal. You cannot ignore addressing the issue. Whether it succeeds or not is a different issue. But let me tell you, if you ask me one positive, I mean mainly negative about BRICS, which is true. I have one very positive if I take something out of it, doesn't require the BRICS structure, is this whole discussion of bilateral investment now coming from China to India. I have been writing about for years. It doesn't make sense for two countries to be trading so much and having no investment. Now here then the issue of security will come. So if that ever happens, I would say that's the most important positive aspect.
I think this reference to terrorism is important, and it was rightly done. It is part of the approach given by a country right now.
That's right.
And I would compliment, in fact, both the Indian diplomacy and our Prime Minister for taking up in a very appropriate manner, where you haven't got involved beyond a point, but have put in the effort to continue to corner and isolate Pakistan on this issue.
One last question, just this one-liner from each one of you. Now, if you look at the world, the US is becoming more and more introspective, and if Trump comes to power, it might even become isolationist in trade matters. You have Europe, which is floundering in terms of confidence. There's Brexit and there are other people who might be leaving the EU. What kind of leadership is needed at this time? And can a small grouping like BRICS provide it, or can BRICS, or will BRICS have to expand?
I don't think BRICS can provide that kind of alternate leadership. And I don't think it is the right moment for BRICS to expand. It has to first digest what it's doing and then move ahead.
I think the value of BRICS today would be to show how alternative development strategies can be evaluated, be formed, which can actually be addressing the people.
My question is that, as far as I can see, BRICS as an economic grouping has no future. And I'm going to discuss this 5 years down the line. But, as I said, if this BRICS summit was required for India to agree that we do need Chinese foreign investment in India, I think that can be the biggest game changer.
All right, we've really run out of time. I'd like to thank all of you, Professor Manoj, Pant, Professor Alka, Acharya, Ambassador Ajai Malhotra, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Until then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.